What happens when an idealistic and hopeful individual is hated, persecuted, manipulated, and forced to see the near extinction of their own kind for decades just because of who and what they are? Well, you're left with someone almost completely unrecognizable to the person they once were, forced to compromise and align themselves with who they used to call the enemy, forced to cut their losses and accept the world for what it is, forced to let a dream die. But what if they could see that younger, more hopeful and idealistic version of themselves again? What would they think if they could see where all their decisions led them? They'd most likely be terrified, disappointed, and hurt, knowing that by giving up on the dream, that this is what their lives will and have become, because it isn't the dream they had. But how did we get to this point? Well, if I could put it into perspective, Cyclops got spawn trapped in a 1v6 on fucking Nuketown. He lost his family. Then there's the uncontrollable optic blast, and then there's the life Scott was just forced to live as the ultimate leader of the uncanny X-Men by his untrustworthy teacher / father figure, Charles Xavier, with the dream that one day human and mutant kind could learn to peacefully coexist. Approaching Scott with the promise of one day being able to control his powerful gift, with the slight catch of leading a team of other kids with snow powers, wings, and a guy with hands for feet, who barely had a handle on their own gifts, to fight against a brotherhood of evil mutants led by his ex-best friend / helmet lover, Magneto. You know, because that's perfectly normal. Now, these comics in the time they were made were in their infancy, so they are extremely campy and don't quite spare a moment to sit with the heavier themes the X-Men were trying to represent, that being identity, prejudice, and the struggle of an acceptance for change. So you'd mostly get paragraphs of the X-Men members yapping in a panel explaining everything about themselves to the most minute detail, Xavier struggling to keep it in his pants near minors, along with overseeing Iceman's pole dancing sessions. Although, let's not ignore that Cyclops had to spend his days worrying about accidentally opening his eyes and destroying everything around him. Like, just waking up from bed and opening his eyes, he could kill somebody if not for his visor. But also had to live out every day at a constant 100% pace, looking out for his teammates, keeping tabs on their capabilities, and how to improve upon them. Never quite allowing himself to just breathe because there was so much pressure put on him. And if he had a problem with how things were being ran around the mansion, bloop. Okay, that doesn't happen. That we know of. I got my fucking eyes on you. When approached with the mere idea that Scott could be cured of his optic blasts, Xavier scoffs at the idea and repeatedly calls his uncontrollable power a gift. A gift that Scott has responsibility to use for the betterment of mutant kind at like 17 years old, or 16, or 21. Marvel never quite gets the age right. But thinking about what Cyclops had to live with day to day, like actually sitting with that, it sounds like hell. Yet there would be at least one silver lining that made the hell somewhat tolerable, and that was Jean Grey. These two have an epic romance spanning decades of shared happiness, sadness, pain, and a kind of love you won't understand until you've had it for yourself. Scott's had to watch the love of his life die in front of him more than a couple of times. He's had a child with Jean, but not really Jean, just an exact copy of Jean that he'd soon leave for the real Jean, which later made that exact copy of Jean become evil and work with the fucking devil. And don't even get me started on the amount of times this dude cheats on Jean because he doesn't know what his purpose is. That child they also had together became infected by a technovirus, and so he had to send that kid into the future to have a better chance at living, which continuously ate away at Scott as the years trudged on because he'd been separated from his son forever, only for the writers to twist the knife further by allowing Scott to raise his son for a short while in an apocalyptic future, and then reunite later to find himself younger than his own son. Anyway, the point I'm attempting to make is that Scott is imperfect, and has lived an imperfect life, but that it doesn't discredit him as a person, nor with his dreams of a better tomorrow. I mean, Jean's never stopped being the one that completed Scott, no matter how many times she could have left his ass. But it was because of Scott's inherent idealism that she could always believe in Scott, and if there was ever a moment of doubt within him, Jean would always be there to lift Scott up to be that guy she knew he could be, and they'd power through adversity together. They're legendary lovers. But then the early 2000s came along and snowballed into Scott becoming everything he supposedly hated, and for good reason. Genosha, a home to millions of mutants, was completely obliterated. Then the love of his life, Jean Grey, was killed by Magneto. And the cherry on top of it all, the Scarlet Witch created a world in which everyone got what they always wanted. In which case, Scott got to finally lead a normal life, just to rip it all away and bring the mutant population from at least 1 billion down to just 200 and dwindling. This era of the X-Men is so desolate. A specific moment I can cling to was when Mullet-Man and his partner were having a child. It was this big event because it meant that mutant kind still had a chance to grow again. There was this immense relief from the mutants that were left, that there was still a future worth fighting for. And after 9 months of pregnancy and hope, poof, diminished in a second. It turned out that the baby was nothing more than a dupe of Mullet-Man, and that there was never going to be a bright future with mutants. only further desolation. And all everyone was left to wonder after the fact was, what do we fight for now? Where do we go from here? Well, the world in its undying hatred for mutants just said,
yo, fuck them,
and relegated them to a rock just off the coast of San Francisco referred to as Utopia. They're given a dirt rock in the water to live on in squalor. And if a mutant wasn't on said Utopia, no matter how many were left, there'd be those that'd make it their mission to kill them because the near extinction of mutant kind made the hunt all the more enticing. So in order to protect what remained of mutant kind, Scott had to make the hard calls that no one else could. Torture, forming his own personal hit squad, and commanding that every living mutant still left was to be a soldier for the mutant cause. At this point, whatever semblance of the dream Xavier put into Scott's head was now completely diminished, because the dream became about nothing but survival, feeling almost as if Scott had finally graduated as he started to see that maybe Xavier was wrong all along. Now, this is the part of the video where I'll confess how I've actually grown to dislike Charles Xavier the more I've read up on X-Men.
And to explain why I don't like him, I'm gonna talk about Magneto.
Okay, so Magneto was pitted out to be the villain, right? Well, you look at Magneto and know what he stands for. Magneto is mutant and proud, who's willing to do anything to expedite the betterment of mutant kind. He shouts this to the world because he believes in it. He's not the kind of man who will hide behind someone or something to make progress on his dream. Magneto is a Jew that lived through World War II that was placed in a camp by Nazis and forced to lose everything he ever loved. And then when the world got wind of mutants, he had the foresight to see it happening all over again. And the worst part about it, Magneto was right. A comic I love featuring Magneto that validates his perspective is a one-shot comic called X-Men Mythos, where it famously opens with Magneto murdering 3 white supremacists in retaliation for murdering a little mutant girl by throwing her from the back of a moving vehicle, killing each of these guys in the most brutal of ways with his magnetism, like stripping the iron from one person's blood and turning it into a nail and shooting it in the other's head. Now, when it cuts to Xavier and the X-Men, in the background, a motion for a Mutant Registration Act had been dismissed by the government. It's an act to further the endless oppression of mutants and expedite their containment within camps. That's like the word of the day, I guess. Magneto in this story attacks a military base for seemingly no apparent reason at first. But when confronted by the X-Men, Magneto reveals that the government may have not passed the act to the public, but behind the scenes, the base was already serving as a DNA testing facility that for the past 3 years had been logging mutants and assigning ID numbers to them without their knowledge, in efforts of one day hunting them all down and eliminating them almost exactly like what happened to Magneto when he was a child. And so every act Magneto commits going forward is to ensure that one day a mother or father can look upon their child and marvel at their gifts, rather than hide in fear for what will come after them. If I could put it in a simple way, Magneto wants to break down the walls built around mutants, while Xavier seeks to maintain them. Usually when the X-Men have to coexist with Magneto, they're often shown improving upon each other, making significant progress in terms of how the world views mutants. Because without Xavier, the X-Men are actually allowed to think for themselves and adapt to the world around them. Don't get me wrong, Xavier's dream of a world where humans and mutants can coexist is a worthwhile dream, but it's a dream that he deliberately makes come with the price of obligation. An obligation to tolerate, to accept the way that the world is and hope that it will reform itself on its own. And then there's the issue of Charles Xavier's savior complex. He deliberately takes in those that cannot fend for themselves who have potential like Scott, and shoves down their throats everything he believes in, what views Scott should have, and raises him up from a rigid and shy boy into a strong soldier with Xavier's beliefs drilled into his head that can carry out Xavier's dream by leading Xavier's covert team of mutants. Xavier wants to own everything that comes with accomplishing his dream, because Xavier wants to own a world he can feel belonged in. Even the catchphrase, "To me, my X-Men," is Xavier being possessive over the X-Men. He's claiming ownership off of the backs of his students whom he'll gladly send to their deaths, like one of Scott's brothers, and then sweep it under the rug like it's nothing. Or better yet, keeping a sentient life form imprisoned in his basement for decades to project holograms and deadly opponents for his students to train against, to the point of even erasing someone from the timeline because of the danger they could cause, rather than looking past that and helping them actually control their gifts, like this fuck-ass dude likes to call for a dude with the power of 3 faces.
It's like Ava Bell once said, the one that teaches one thing, but says the hell with it when it's inconvenient.
It's usually when Xavier either dies or goes off on a vacation in space, Scott is left behind to see the value in both Xavier's and Magneto's dreams, just as he can see the flaws, and works toward combining both into a reality. Hell, even when the dream was challenged by someone like William Stryker, Xavier was going to give up and disband the X-Men, until Scott stepped in and said that the X-Men as an idea goes on with or without him. And if they were to give up on the dream, then they were never the heroes they let everyone else believe they were. The world needs the X-Men, Simple as that. The difference between when Xavier says "to me, my X-Men" and Scott saying it, Xavier is claiming ownership over the dream, while Scott is sharing the dream. A dream that once finally accomplished after the deaths of millions of mutants on Genosha, the near extinction level event of mutants because of the Scarlet Witch, and somehow finding the time to mentor Batman, when finally given the power by the Phoenix Force to accomplish it. Charles Xavier takes a long look at what they achieved without him, and claims that there wasn't enough sacrifice. Tell me, who's the villain here?
Because I don't think it's who you think it is.
Alright, I am leaving out a few details here, and I'm obviously being biased to prove my point. During this event, it wasn't exactly sunshine and rainbows. Those affected by the Phoenix Force, although helping the world in solving world hunger and air pollution and every other problem you could think of, were also influenced by the Phoenix Force to act on their darkest impulses. In this case, when Cyclops was affected and murdered Xavier, it was a dark impulse the Phoenix acted upon because of all Xavier's lies and manipulations brought to light. And when eliminating one thing that Cyclops grew to hate, it set its destructive power against all of Earth. Since Scott always hated the fact that the world hated him because of a label, leading to the Phoenix Force being extinguished by the Scarlet Witch and Hope Summers, rendering Scott vulnerable to the wrath of the world. Yet from Scott's destruction came the rebirth of mutant kind once more. And now, after living through the near extinction of his kind and left to rot in a cell after saving it, without hesitation, the world would already plan to put those affected by the mutant rebirth into concentration camps, in which Cyclops grew to see that Magneto was kind of onto something from the very beginning. That if you want to secure a better future for yourself and future generations, you have to fucking fight for it by starting a revolution against your oppressors. And so Scott would start his revolution with the help of magic and Magneto, which brings you completely up to speed on how Scott became what he always hated. Wait, why the fuck is a younger version of him here now? Well, it's because of everyone's favorite mutant, Beast. Beast decided that all hope for mutant kind ever achieving a semblance of peace was extinguished, taking it upon himself to travel back in time and gather the original X-Men, in hopes that when bringing them to the present, that when everyone saw them, including Cyclops, that it'd snap them all out of it and come back together. But that does not happen. Like at all. And if anything, only cements the decisions they've made when reminded of all the horrors that could have been avoided if they just never became X-Men. And this just sucks for Scott on so many levels because he arrives to the future to discover that he kills his own mentor, finds out he becomes the villain, and that there isn't anything he can do to change it. The future sucks. Well, I mean, he gets to reunite with his father and adventure in space and stuff, which is pretty cool. It does start off a bit rocky because Scott looks at his father as though he fled off to space to knock around as a pirate and get high or whatever. But when he confronts his father on this, Scott learns that the idea of his father he's had in his head while stranded on some faraway planet in space couldn't be more wrong. Because after the plane crash occurred, Corsair set out on a revenge quest against the Shi'ar for killing his wife. At which point, because he'd been out of Scott's and Alex's life for so long, Corsair felt that it was better that he just never came back into their lives. But a son will always need his father, and that was something Corsair learned all too late. So aside from that, the future still kinda sucks. And it's not just young Scott that thinks this either. Jean Grey reads the mind of Beast and gets a compilation of all the X-Men's moments, perfect to cataclysmic. And at the center of a majority of them is Scott. And like most teenagers, Jean seeing what her future looks like and the choices she'll make, that keep in mind, she has no say in, rebels, and does anything she possibly can to do the opposite, which only expedites her evolution into a telepath with no discipline or understanding of the power and its consequences, as she constantly invades the minds of others or controls them against their own will, even invading the minds of both Scott from the past and future just to see how much they both truly love her, only to despise the cost of that love, and the fact that she'll still share a life with Scott in the future regardless of how she feels. Then there's Beast, who discovers that he'll be blue with thumbs for toes. Angel, yeah, that happens. And Iceman. Actually, Iceman turns out okay. It's like the running joke of the series that he's just the same. Totally the same. Feel how you want to feel about that, but while it's meant to be comedic, this is an actual reality for some people. See, when the young Iceman confronts the present-day Iceman explains that being gay was something that genuinely got away from him. When he was just becoming a mutant, he was also having confusing feelings about what he liked, and then he got thrusted into being an X-Man. And to Bobby, it was like one half of him was constantly being hated, and then the other side of him that no one knew about was just as hated. So to Bobby, it was like he had to pick one struggle and leave the other one behind if he ever wanted to be accepted. And so tricking himself into liking women for decades, over time it just began to feel like it was too late to accept that part of himself and truly be whole as a person. I read this and I thought of an instance I had in my life kind of similar to this, where a friend came out and had doubts about whether to embrace that part of himself because he too felt it was too late. One, I was like, damn, this is a peak Iceman reference. And two, It's never too late to become who you really want to be, but that is also so much fucking easier said than done. So after discovering how each of their lives panned out, and seeing the horrible state that the world is in with mutants, they mostly decide to stay and repair the mindset the world had on mutant kind before returning to their time. In which the fact that the original X-Men can look square in the face of their horrifying futures and still choose to have faith that mutants and humankind can live as one, no matter how impossible it may seem to achieve, it affects everyone in such an inspiring way that it finally incites all of mutant kind to come together, not for fighting or imposing beliefs or to pick sides, but to stand united and show the world that change is possible, that any number of mutants can come together and be as one peacefully, in which the world sees what Cyclops truly meant by his mutant revolution and starts buying into it. But in the end, it's still never enough, is it? Because next thing you know, they gotta stop the snooze fest that is the Inhumans, and I mean, just look at these fuckers. They're smiling at mutant genocide. Okay, now I'm obviously exaggerating, but something called the Terrigen Mist, which creates Inhumans, becomes deadly to mutants. So in retaliation, the X-Men change the Terrigen Mist and sacrifice a few mutants in the battle to prevent it from killing more mutants. And it's in Scott's refusal to be taken prisoner after his actions, and his refusal of backing down from what he believes in, that the Inhumans kill Cyclops as punishment for his crimes against them, in which Cyclops dies fighting for the future of mutant kind, and in turn becomes a martyr to the mutant cause. But that isn't quite the whole truth, because Scott died before the fight against the Inhumans ever even began. See, Scott had been one of the Terrigen Mist's first victims, and Scott, knowing he'd die, would entrust Emma Frost with his vision, and so Emma projected the image of Cyclops out to everyone as if he were still alive. So that way, instead of dying in some lab for no good reason, she rewrote Scott's end to have meaning and to immortalize him as an idea. What's cool about this story is that if you don't know the twist, it may come out of left field. However, if you do know the twist, which I kinda did spoil for you, I'm sorry, some of the dialogues between Emma and other mutants like the triplets have an aura of dread around them that makes rereading this event worth it. It's like they know Scott isn't actually in front of them, but they know they have to keep up the performance because of what the lie means for mutant kind and its future. But to see Scott be used as a puppet for someone else's vision, it's grotesque. Even more so now because people going forward will start using Scott as an example to fit their vendetta as an excuse to cause chaos under the false pretense that it's for the good of mutant kind, all the while completely missing the point of what Cyclops was actually fighting for. And to top it off, the young Cyclops had to watch his own death and somehow learn to come to grips with that fate. After which, I read a really mid follow-up to the Young X-Men story because I thought it would actually matter to the video, but it didn't. And I got so bored that I had an edible and watched X-Men First Class, only to get fixated on the fact that when Kevin Bacon wears the signature Magneto helmet, you can clearly tell it was fitted for Michael Fassbender, and they just didn't have the time to make another, so Kevin Bacon is just drowning in the helmet. Anyways, Secret Wars occurs, which leads young Scott to try and run away from his fate he can only delay for the time being, in which Scott joins a team of heroes called the Champions to forget his future for a while, and I'll tell you firsthand, it's a beautiful series. At first meeting the team, Miles, Nova, Kamala, Amadeus, and Viv think that Scott will turn out to be a villain like they've been led to believe by all the best medias in one. But when thinking about it, the young Scott situation and how he's stranded in a time where he's a villain that's trying to make good, and with a mission statement like the Champions have about enforcing justice without unjust force, and to do things the right way with wisdom and hope, how could they believe in something like that if they didn't give Scott a chance to prove them wrong? And while not spoiling this story, I think it's worth mentioning that after spending such close time with the Champions, watching Avatar: The Last Airbender and Seinfeld, on top of saving the world, something that touched me about this arc was Scott opening up with his new friends about the life he leads and the burdens he carries with it in issue 12. In this issue, everyone on the team makes remarks about how wound up he always is, and never leaves room to just relax. But when affected by some residual feedback from some Z-list villain, all of a sudden Scott is flying with his laser vision and recklessly endangering the team for the fun of it, only to break down seconds later by yelling at himself that he can't make mistakes. He's not allowed to goof off, because he thinks that if he ever lets anyone down, that he'd be nothing but a burden. Then, in a different scene, he reflects that he doesn't know how to live with the man he'll later become. And it's at this very moment the team can tell that Cyclops has been carrying something alone for far too long. A weight that's been eating away at him to the very core, as Scott feels like he was pushed on a path before he ever had a chance to choose otherwise. Even before this, he had to carry the dangerous power that lied within him, which others viewed as a curse. And because of his great power, he was never seen as anything but a soldier that could serve out someone else's dream, since that was all he was needed for. So day in, day out, Scott kept soldiering on, thinking he couldn't be anything else, that he wasn't allowed to let go for even a second because of all the expectations and responsibilities thrusted upon him. So with that unbearable weight and power eating away at him, Scott has been slowly falling apart. The power that made him into who he is and will later become has finally broken him. But when Scott opens up about this to the team, it's beautiful because it's not like Scott is admitting defeat, but finally gaining something back from a life that's done nothing but take and take. And it may sound silly to say, but when it came time for the original X-Men to finally go home, I felt a deep sadness because it meant saying goodbye to these characters, especially Scott. This version of him hit close to home for plenty of reasons, enough that I'd make a video about him, like everyone judging him because of actions he had yet to commit. My father was an alcoholic piece of shit that made it everyone's business. So naturally, as I got older, it felt like everyone I knew would look at me waiting for the same thing to happen. It may also sound corny, but I was diagnosed as a kid with something where I have trouble conversing or telling stories in a way for others to properly understand. Almost like the dyslexic version of conversations in writing. So growing up, I was just chalked off as stupid by many people and labeled as such before I ever got a word out. I had to learn very early in my life how to mask that shit and slowly get better at just being normal all my life. But even to this day, it's something I still can't control, which in turn made me close myself off to a lot of people and pretend to be someone I wasn't, in which I found that the more boring I appeared to others, the less people were interested in keeping tabs on me, and the less I had to pretend. But bearing all that weight alone does no one any good. Even so, I learned that by revealing that weight to the wrong people, it made that weight even heavier, because then it set the bar of expectations. That if I couldn't handle something, I was a failure, like their idea of my father, or that I was an idiot. So I couldn't let myself give in to admit failure, because then I would be what everyone thought of me. Now I can say that that's not quite how I view my life anymore, but God, do I wish I could hug my younger self and just tell him how great life will reveal itself to be. The people who'd become my day ones, the fears I'd face and wonder why I was so afraid, falling in love, and growing into the person my younger self hoped he'd become. In a way, he's still there in these words I'm reading right now. And I think that's why I feel such a deep connection to the character of Cyclops, as corny as that may be. Anyway, when the original X-Men go back to their original timeline, they implant a trigger in each of their minds so that they'd forget their time in the present until closing the loop, in which the past catches up to the present, and Scott is back to life somehow with big plans for the future with the memories of the life he'd forgotten for years, leading into the Krakoa era where, after the mass majority of humankind wanted to see mutants go extinct for decades, to the point even a mere 200 was still too much for them to hate. Here they found themselves with their own island, open to all mutants, thriving and achieving the greatest comeback in the history of the universe. All the work, all the sacrifices, all the time, where once there was a doubt the dream could come true, it was on Krakoa that fear was finally put to rest. On Krakoa, it finally became mutant kind who spoke and humanity that listened. Everything they'd fought for had finally paid off. And yet, unfortunately, because the X-Men are perfectly imperfect people, no matter how much good they'll end up doing, it'll always be easier for people to hate than to love and build off of a dream that isn't certain to work out, which requires the X-Men to go backwards more often than they'd like to in order to move forward. Since now, currently in X-Men comics, the Age of Krakoa, how should I put this, has caved in on itself like a sandcastle against the crashing waves of time. Mutant kind is forced to once again, with no other choice, start all over from square one, as Scott is making do with what little is left by leading a portion of mutant kind through this new frontier while hanging by a thread himself. And can you really hold that against Scott? He essentially experienced heaven only to have it ripped away from him. If there is a way back from that, Scott and the rest of mutant kind have a long road ahead of them. Now, since I cannot speak for the future quality of the X-Men comic as a whole, what I will say is that despite the road of pain that had been paved out for Cyclops, what I learned from obsessing over him is that we can't wait for change to happen, big or small. It is something that requires work, action, and sheer determination to accomplish. There will never be anything that stands in the way of us except for ourselves, unless if we learn to accept change by leading each day with something as ubiquitous as love. Now that's enough Cyclops for me. I'll catch y'all on the flip side. Thank you.